Hi, this is Tom Lippincott for Modern Guitar Harmony, and in this series of short videos we're going to explore a little bit of the basics of how music is put together and how to apply it to the guitar fingerboard. If there are some of you who've been interested in the Make Good Rick voice leading books or some of the more advanced concepts with harmony and aren't sure where to begin because your music theory background is maybe a little lacking, or maybe you're not sure about knowing your fingerboard very well, the names of the notes and what all these notes do and what are all these things that people talk about, scales, chords, whatever. That's what we're here to sort of go over today, and to clear up some holes in your knowledge that some of you might have that will allow you to finally do a deep dive into the voice leading almanacs and get the amazing information that's contained in there. Okay, so before we get started, for anybody who hasn't seen this guitar that I'm holding, this is an 8-string guitar. As you can see, the inner 6 strings are the same strings as a normal guitar, E, A, D, G, B, E. I just happen to have an extra string on either edge of the fingerboard, high A and a low B down here, but all the stuff we're going to be dealing with today is just going to deal with the inner 6 strings, just as if I had a 6-string guitar. The only other thing different about this instrument is the fan frets, but open string, 1st fret, 2nd fret, 3rd fret, 4th fret, tuning, intonation is exactly the same as on a regular guitar. Okay, so now with that out of the way, let's jump right in and talk about some harmony basics. So the first thing we need to talk about is the major scale, and in particular the C major scale. The major scale we could consider as the alphabet for music. For anything concerning melodies and harmonies, the major scale is the basic building blocks that we use to put those things together, just as the English alphabet is the basic components that we use to build words and sentences and paragraphs and so forth. The C major scale is the basic one that we start with. Why it's not the A major scale, which is the first letter of the alphabet, I remember reading, and I actually don't remember exactly why, but the starting point for the major scale is the note C. And on a piano keyboard, you can see, most of you have probably seen a piano keyboard before, all the white notes make up the C major scale. And that sounds like this. So I played from C to C. Now on my guitar, I'm playing on the B string, your 2nd string of your guitar. I start on the 1st fret. That note is C. And what I'm doing is I'm playing this little formula. You can see on the piano keyboard again that in between most of the white notes there are black keys. And you can see that that first note is C, second note is D, and in between C and D there's this black key that says C sharp, D flat. What that means is that there's this extra note in between those first two, and because there's that extra note in there, we call that a whole step. Any of the keys that doesn't have an extra black key will be a half step. So as you can see, the notes E and F have no black key, and the notes B and the octave C, when we get to the end of the scale, those two notes also have no black key in between them. So on the guitar, that translates as 2 frets equals a whole step, 1 fret equals a half step. So if I start on my 1st fret, C, I'm going to go up a whole step on this string, 2 frets, and that 2nd note that I play is D, up 2 more frets, there's E, up 1 fret now to F, up 2 frets, G, 2 more frets, A, 2 more frets, B, and finally 1 fret, and I'm at what we call the octave. You can hear that those 2 notes sound basically like the same note. I just played C in a bunch of different octaves, and just about anybody can hear that those sound like the same note, but higher or lower. We get this intuitive sense of that. Those are the notes of the C major scale translated to the guitar fingerboard on the B string. Okay, so now you'll see the graphic that I have that depicts notation, which we'll get into later, shows tablature, and shows the note names. And also we have this WH and H, which simply means whole and half. So the major scale, in addition to having these notes, also has a formula, which means between the first note and the second note is a whole step, between the second note and the third note, another whole step, between the third note and the fourth note, a half step, a whole step, fourth to fifth, whole step fifth to sixth, whole step sixth to seventh, and then seventh to eighth, which is where octave gets its name, half step. And so we can say that the formula for the major scale, without having to even think about letter names like ABC, is whole step, half, whole, half. Now, one point to make is sometimes people get confused about this. They'll say, okay, whole, half. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That's because I called this note a whole step. The whole step is actually the distance between this note and this note. So you don't get the whole step until you play the second note. So whole step, whole, half, whole, half. Okay, so that's the major scale played just on the B string. Now we can also play a C major scale on other strings as well, as long as we can find C. For example, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this on this video, but if I go to my G or third string, the 5th fret note is also C, that same note. And if I want to play a C major scale on the 3rd string, all I need to do is start on C, plug in my formula, and play that same thing. Whole, half, whole, half. And what do you know? It's the same exact notes, same sound, everything, and also the note names are the same. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Notice that when I got to G, C, D, E, F, G, the next note is not H unless you're in Germany, but Germans have a different way of, they do have a letter H. I'm not exactly sure how that stuff all works, but anyway, in most parts of the English-speaking world, we say G, and we start over again at the alphabet on A, B, C. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. C, here, back on the B string, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now, I can actually play a C major scale on any of the other strings. For example, my 5th string I can play down on the 3rd fret C. It's an octave lower. You can hear it's a lower sounding C. But once again, formula, whole, half, whole, half. I can play it on the high E string starting at the 8th fret. Now I'm an octave higher than I was before, and I'm going to have to go pretty high up on the neck. Maybe some of you have a guitar that won't go this high, depending on how many frets you have, but whole, half, whole, half, or C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Of course, most of you probably already know if I go down to the low E string, I get the same fret, same note name, just 2 octaves lower, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C on the low E string. And then finally on the D string, I have to go all the way up to the 10th fret to find a C on this string. And on my guitar, I can play a whole C scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, because I have 22 frets. For anybody that has less than 22, you won't be able to go all the way. But I can also go the opposite direction. I can go downward. And here, I would consider, if I'm going backwards on the C major scale, go back to my B string, I go down a half step, down a whole, half, whole. I just go in reverse. So if I wanted to start on C on the 10th fret of the D string, just go in reverse. Half, whole, half, whole. And of course now I'm at the open string D. I'm not able to finish out the scale on this same string, but of course if I go down to C on the 5th string, I've got my, so there's my C major scale, mostly on the D string. I just had to get that lowest note on the A string. Okay, so that's kind of how the C major scale is laid out on the different strings on the guitar fingerboard. This is all really valuable stuff. If you've never done this before, I would highly recommend spending as much time as you need going over each individual string and getting to know where all those notes are, both by the formula and also by the note names. And we'll talk in a few minutes about some ways that you can reinforce learning those techniques. Let's go back to the C major scale on the B string. So again, first fret, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now, there's another way, yet again, besides note names and whole, whole, half, that stuff, that musicians also have of designating these notes in the scale, and that is, this one's a little simpler though, is by giving them numbers. Now, the only exception will be the first note. Most people usually call this the root. Root like the root of a tree, being the lowest thing, the thing that everything is built on. So that's easy to remember. But then everything else gets a number. The second note, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And then when we get to the octave or the eighth note, we just say it's the root again, because it's still C. So root, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, root. And by the same token, just like there are distances between one note and another note that's 2 frets away, there are distances between a note that's 4 frets away, let's say, or 5 frets away, and each one of those gets named a name based on that number. So we can also, using this designation, say from the root of the scale to the second, well, it's the distance between the root and the second note of a major scale, so by you using logic, it makes sense. You call it a major second. In other words, the interval between here and here is also called a major second, in addition to being a whole step. Okay, what about the distance between the root and the third note of the scale? If you said major third, you're right. From C to E, we call that a major third because it's the distance between the root and the third note of a major scale. Now, you can see that I have a couple of frets that I didn't really address. What about that one? I go from C up a half step, and we saw on the piano keyboard earlier before that this could either be called C sharp or D flat. We'll get into the specifics of when we use one name or the other, but generally speaking, we consider if you go up from C, we'll call it C sharp, and if we start on D and go down, we'll call it D flat. Anyway, for right now, it doesn't really matter, but the point that is important here is the distance from the root to the note that's 1 fret above, that's not really in the major scale. Well, it's smaller than the major second was, right? Well, a word that means small is minor. So if we say it's a minor second, 1 fret on the guitar, in addition to being called a half step, can also be called a minor second. So we have minor second, major second, and then, yes, you guessed it, minor third is 3 frets, major third, the distance between the root and the third. Now, using logic, you'd say, okay, then this is going to be a major fourth, major fifth, minor fifth, or, you know, whatever. Yes and no. We'll come back to that. Now, music, just like language, is something that developed gradually over hundreds of years, and no one person sat down and wrote a logical book of, you know, everything being internally consistent. Just like with language, you know. English language is crazy that way, right? There's words that are spelled really weird ways and not pronounced the right way. I really feel sorry for anybody who English is not their first language and they're trying to learn it, because it's a crazy language. Well, music has those things too, and we'll get back to the fourth and fifth note of the major scale, but let's move on for right now to the 6th and 7th intervals. So between the root and the 6th note of the scale, we call that a major 6th. Between the root and the half step below that is a minor 6th. In this case, I would call it A flat or G sharp. Probably would call it A flat, since I'm thinking minor, smaller, taking A and making it smaller. And then the distance between C and this B up at the 12th fret, major 7th, of course, and then minor 7th, first fret to 11th fret. So those are the other intervals that now, let's get back to the root to the 4th, root to the 5th. Why are those different? Well, back in the early Middle Ages, people hadn't really named the intervals as we're doing, and they didn't really use them these intervals that much. Things like seconds, minor second, those things sound crazy and weird, kind of dissonant. And back in the Middle Ages, of course, people didn't really have much of an understanding about how the world worked and science, and they attributed anything that was weird as being evil, and, you know, you shouldn't use that. However, the distance between the root and the fourth note and the root and the fifth note have these pure, stately, kind of beautiful sounds to them. So they figured those must be the holy intervals. And so because they're holy, they're perfect. And so we call this a perfect fourth interval. And we also call the distance between the root and the fifth note of the scale a perfect fifth interval. Here, notice I'm playing harmonic intervals, meaning I'm playing two notes at the same time instead of one after the other. It's still a perfect fifth, whether you play them at the same time or one after the other, or go down instead of up. Any of those is still considered a perfect fifth, perfect fourth. That's little tricks you can do to learn what these intervals sound like. I'm not going to get too deeply into that, but for example, the song Here Comes the Bride. So those first two notes, Here Comes the Bride, that's the interval of perfect fourth. The theme from Star Wars. So the first two notes of Star Wars is a perfect fifth. And there are other songs that, different people use to remember what the different intervals sound like. Anyway, the only one that we haven't talked about yet is the one in between the fourth and the fifth. Root to half step between the fourth and the fifth. Okay, we could either consider this to be taking the fourth and raising it, or taking the fifth and lowering it. And we're also going to use different designations for that as well. If we take a perfect fourth and make it bigger, we call it augmented fourth. So it's different than calling it, major or extra or whatever. Or if we take a perfect fifth and lower it, we say it's not minor but diminished, which kind of makes sense again because augmented means big and diminish means small. So we're taking a fifth and making it smaller, taking a fourth and making it bigger, augmented. And the same holds true if we raise the fifth, we can call it an augmented fifth. And if we lower the fourth, we can call it a diminished fourth. That one in particular isn't used very often. But anyway, that covers all of the different intervals. And this is important once you get into harmony, because what makes harmony and chords sound the way they do is because of the intervals contained in the different harmonies and chords. We touched briefly a few minutes ago on sharps and flats. Now let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So again, looking at our piano keyboard, you can see that all the white notes have nothing after the letter, right? Just C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And anything that isn't one of those notes, anything that's a black note on the keyboard, is going to be either a sharp note or a flat note. And again, we'll get into this later of when we would call this note D flat versus C sharp. But again, just as a general rule, if you started on D and went down, you probably would call it D flat. If you started on C and went up, you'd call it C sharp. So the other sharp and flat notes, another name for them is accidentals. I have no idea why, because if you accidentally play one in the key of C, it doesn't sound very good. I don't know. But anyway, we have D sharp and E flat, which is on the fourth fret here of the B string. And that's the distance from C to E flat or D sharp is a minor third. And then those are E and F. The note between F and G is either F sharp or G flat. The note in between G and A could either be G sharp or A flat. And then finally, the note in between A and B could either be A sharp or B flat. One thing I will point out is in jazz, if you're a jazz musician, which most people that are delving into all this harmony stuff tend to have some interest in jazz at least. Well, because jazz started out as a horn player centric music, meaning the horn players were kind of the ones that invented all this stuff. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail here, but most horns, saxophones, trumpets, and so forth, it's easier to play flats than it is sharps. And so most of the time, if you're a jazz player, you kind of have to get used to thinking of flats most of the time rather than sharps. And this, I've noticed that a lot of guitar players that are not familiar with jazz tend to favor the sharps string players that are orchestral players like violin and cello and so forth, they also, tend to favor sharps because that's what they see the most. But in jazz, we tend to see flats the most. So I would also urge you that if you're new to this stuff and you do want to play jazz, that you start getting used to thinking of the notes as flat, their flat versions the most, although you still want to be aware of the sharp versions as well. Okay, so that's going to do it for part 1 here, and we'll see you in part 2 where we'll continue on talking about transposing the major scale into different keys.